Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Crawley. I'm head of Equitable Development and Migration at the University Center for Policy Research in New York. And I'd like to very warmly welcome you to this Migration Policy Roundtable in partnership with the Migration for Development and Equality Hub, MIDEQ, and with Positive Negatives. Welcome to everybody. Just a little bit before we begin about the roundtable series. UNU-CPR likes to create the space for different actors from different policy backgrounds, as well as migrants and those in the migration policy space, to really come together and discuss some of the pressing issues that we're working on together. It's a space really to discuss new research and to have a quite in-depth conversation around some of the issues that this raises for the way in which we do migration policy. So we've had events, for example, on the Global Compact on Migration, its implementation process, on decent work for migrants in the Global South, on climate-related mobility and urbanization. And we have an event in September, actually, on gender and migration. So this is the fourth event in the series. And as I say, it's really a space to be able to discuss some of these issues that we're all grappling with in more detail. And you'll see that we're recording the event because we like to continue the conversation after the event itself and pick up some of the discussions as well. So the focus of this particular roundtable is on how we understand and think about the experiences of children in migrant households in the Global South. And the paper, the event is based on a UNU-CPR discussion paper entitled From Left Behind to Staying Back, Changing How We Think About Children in Migrant Households. And that paper that's been produced by colleagues from the MIDEQ Hub has been published today, and it's now available online. And my colleague will give you the link in the chat so that you can access it and read it at your leisure. So the report is co-authored by MIDEQ's researchers who work on the childhood inequalities strand. And we're delighted that those co-authors have been able to join us today to discuss their research and the implications for migration policy making. I should say that Mackenzie Seaman at Samuel Hall has also done a really brilliant job in helping us to sort of corral our ideas around this theme. And although Mackenzie's not speaking today, I'd like to thank her very much for her very important role in the production of the report. So let me just say a little bit more about MIDEQ for those of you that don't know. MIDEQ is one of 12 interdisciplinary international research hubs funded by the UK Research and Innovation, UKRI, through the Global Challenges Research Fund. And the project focuses on the relationships between migration, development, and equality in the context of the Global South, where a large and in fact growing proportion of migration takes place, around a third of all international migration, in fact, and up to 70% of migration in some places. Now, one of the aims, aside from producing new empirical data, is really to shift the production of knowledge to the Global South, where this migration is taking place, in order that we can understand those issues, those challenges from the perspective of those who are living and working in the Global South. A lot of migration policy, of course, has been dominated by the political and policy interests of the countries in the Global North. So MIDEQ is really doing a lot by way of shifting the production of knowledge through this project, but it also uses a very interesting range of engagement and impact tools to communicate very complex ideas to a wide range of audiences. And we're delighted that the work of MIDEQ's animation partner, Positive Negatives, is also being launched here today. And you'll get to see the first screening of our new animation, The Boy with More, ? Importantly, which is based on MIDEQ's research in Nepal. And Anita will introduce that a little later. So just to explain the format of the event, we'll have 4 speakers, 4 of the co-authors from the different countries that are involved in this research. We'll open up for a Q&A to the panelists, so you can put your questions or your comments in the chat and we'll put them to the speakers. We'll then have an intervention from UNICEF in response to the work, and have then about 30 minutes for discussion on the policy implications of this new way of thinking about the experiences of children in migrant households. So as I say, put your questions and thoughts, comments in the chat box. Before I hand over to our speakers, I'd just like to very briefly introduce some of the main themes and arguments in the paper, and then I'll introduce them both in turn to tell you a little bit more about their work. I think we're very clear, all of us in this event, that migration profoundly affects the lives of children in lots of different ways. And we're also clear that migration in many contexts is increasing in scale. We know that, for example, in the context of China, there are around 61 million children who live in migrant households, around 34% of the population of children in Ghana, in rural Ghana, and 20% in the Philippines. So these are quite significant numbers of children in migrant households. And the phrase left behind has often been used to describe these children who remain in their own country when one or more of their parents or primary caregivers migrate. So our paper and this research that you'll hear about essentially challenges the use of this term, not because there are not negative consequences for children of some of these processes, but because this notion of stay behind children really implies abandonment, especially in the context of mothers migrating. It also implies that children are primarily kind of living with the consequences of the migration process rather than having any agency in how they engage with it. And I think it's very much reflected in the literature that we review in the policy. There's talk of a care deficit, of exploitation and abuse that happens to these children, the negative mental health consequences, and also the social problems. So much of the literature is very negative in relation to this category of left behind children. And I think what you're going to hear from our speakers today, and what you can read about in the paper, is the concern that this phrase left behind mischaracterizes the complex nature of migration in the context of the Global South. It implies abandonment rather than the use of migration as a household strategy. It misunderstands in some way the ways in which family networks operate in many of the contexts. It ignores the wider political and policy context within which families become separated, the fact that children can't move with their parents. And it also kind of, in a way, pathologizes and stigmatizes migrant parents and their children, even though they are already kind of grappling to deal with some of the consequences. And last but not least, it flattens out the experiences of this group of children, who range, of course, from being very, very young to very much near adulthood, and who, you know, live in households where parents migrate for a very long period of time, a short period of time. There's huge complexity and diversity in that experience of migration. So in some ways, I guess, it all adds up to the fact that the left behind child is another kind of representation of the kind of poor child measured against a global North standard of what childhood should look like. So there's a kind of normative underpinning of what children and the family constitute. So I've given you a very broad outline of what the paper discusses, and our speakers are really going to very helpfully unpack some of those ideas by giving you some examples from their research of how this looks in practice, and giving you some of the complexities, of course, as well, between the different regions. So as I say, we're delighted to have them with us, and we really look forward to hearing about what they have to say. And we're going to start, I think, in Nepal, because Nepal is also the basis of the animation that you're going to see after the presentation by Anita Ghimire, Dr. Anita Ghimire, who is the research director of the Nepal Institute for Social and Environmental Research, NISER. Anita has very extensive research of working with adolescent and young people. She has experience of research on gender norms, of migration and health. She's also a fantastic co-investigator on the MIDEQ Hub, and she leads the Hub's work in Nepal, working in the Nepal-Malaysia corridor. So Anita, we're very delighted to have you here. We look forward to your presentation. You have 10 minutes, and I'm going to share your slides now, and you're going to tell me when to move them on.
Okay, thank you very much, Evan. Thank you for the background and for explanation. You have made my work very easy. So yeah, may I kindly request you to start sharing my slide.
Okay, everybody can see that, I hope.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. So hello, everybody. Thank you for your interest. So I'm going to discuss, just as Evan said, about the impact of parents' migration on children. In very brief, it's a very complex issue, as Evan said, and we kind of, in my presentation, I'm going to pretend that they are a homogeneous group, though we know that they are not, because in the interest of time. Evan, can we go to the next slide, please? So this study, as Heaven mentioned, is an ongoing, like it started in 2015, funded by, in 2015, NISER has started with this study. It was funded by SDC in 2017 and 18, and it's currently being funded by MIDEQ since then. And the aim in this presentation is to discuss about the impact of parents' migration on children, and hence to kind of bring children to the center, because when we discuss about the migration development discourse, a lot of time we fail to bring the implication of migration on larger family. We tend to focus on remittances and economic aspects of migration. So this is kind of to highlight the other impacts of migration. Evan, can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So to give you a brief background about Nepal, over a quarter of Nepal's GDP comes from personal remittances. So this year it was 4 billion per annum. The main migration destinations are Malaysia and GCC. They account for 85% of labor migration, though we have increasingly new destinations in Europe as well. Can we go to the next slide, please, Evan? So the picture is the men who are standing in the immigration department in the airport, ready for their migration. So our migration is mostly male dominated. Women make less than 6% of the current migrants. So in year 2022, they made 6% of the migrants, which is already 2% growth from the previous year. So the number of migration of women is growing, but when you look at total, it's only 6%, quite less. But what I have to kind of women go through informal channels, which means that they go as undocumented through informal migration routes, which means that this figure does not represent them, so that it might go up a bit higher than this. And these are, so when you migrate, you have to get your labor permission. So all these, the crowd you see are people who are waiting in the government's office to get their labor permit. Yeah, can we go to the next slide, Evan? So if we look at the current status in 2020, these are latest from the Ministry of Labor, around more than 130,000 people left for foreign. People go 2 to 3 years contract at a time. And mostly they go to the Gulf countries where family reunion is not allowed, and there's no family migration. And see,
Anita, I think we might have lost you a little bit. I think Anita's just dropped away. Hopefully she'll come back in a second.
I've come back. I'm so sorry. I'm in Bangladesh and my internet is not stable. Can you hear me now?
That's okay. We can hear you now. Yes, no problem. Carry on.
Okay. And the spouses, wives of migrants. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, thank you, Evan. So this is me doing my field work in one of the research sites. There's not much to explain. I just wanted to show that these are some of my female returnee respondents. So when we talked about contractual migration, though each period of contract is 2 to 3 years, remigration is very high. And in some provinces, men migrate as soon as they are married, which means that mostly, children grow up without having their father for a long time. They only come back for short periods during the holidays. So children only see their parents, like, when they are growing up, they see them in a very short window, like 2 to 3 months for 2 years or in every 3 years. So most of the communication and the relationship with the father in general is usually only virtual. So these are mostly, when I go to the field, we usually find the grandfathers and the grandchildren. So we don't really find the fathers in the villages. Can we go to the next slide, Heaven? So migration, it has some, if we look at children, it has both positive and negative impacts. So on one hand, there is an investment, there's a growing investment in education of children, including sending them for higher education, educating girls, which is very important, because when the family resources are less, it's usually girls who tend to drop out of school or they're pulled out of school. Also, mostly the parents send the children to quality schools. So in a private English medium schools which are thought to be more have better quality education than the government-run public schools. We also found that in case of migrant children, they have aspirations because there is a confidence that their parents can invest in their education. So their aspirations for higher education is also much higher than their peers whose parents have not migrated. They are more confident about their future aspirations. There's better investment in health and general well-being. People often share that your probability of getting loan for health investment is better if you have a migrant in your household, because your neighbors or the money lenders believe that you are going to pay, which means that if you are sick and you need some loans to pay for your health service, you are more likely to get it if you have a migrant in the household. And we also found that children are exposed to the idea of outside world. Their imaginations of the world outside Nepal is also much stronger because they see it from their parents, from their fathers, than children who are whose parents have not migrated. Can we go to the next slide, Heaven? But we also see that it comes with a lot of cost. So a lot of time, and we spoke to around 20 teachers as well, from both kindergarten and higher secondary teachers. And they say that there is a stark difference when you look at children in their behavior in the classroom. So anxiety, fear, and behavior problems in young children are much more prominent when the mother or the father has migrated. We find that in some provinces where gender norms are very discriminatory towards male and female, boys in particular, they have to take adult roles very soon in the household because their father migrates. So they are usually the adult men in the household, which means that they lose their childhood and their adolescent years. They lack fatherly guidance when growing up, including interaction with teachers. So a lot of children tell us that they wish their fathers were there to kind of interact with the teachers, to talk about the teachers about their study and problem, because in a gender discriminatory society, particular for higher education, the mother would not go to a school to talk with the teacher because the teacher is a male. And then there is social stigma, including that directed towards women and girls of the household, but also to boys in the household. So, and there's a peer pressure leading to overspending, to use alcohol and drug abuse. So these are some of the very very common negative impacts that we have been seeing in all the study districts. Can we go to the next slide, Heaven? Okay, so I'll keep this beautiful picture. So I thank you very much, Evan, for sharing the slide. This is for the next round. So yeah, thank you everybody for your interest. Over to you, Evan.
Thank you very much, Anita. I've just put that last slide up as well, because I know you've been using some very creative methods to access information from the young people.
Yeah, but those two slides, I'll come back when I talk about the animation. So.
Okay. That's great. Thank you very much, Anita. I'm going to hand over to you straight away, actually, to talk about the animation. So continue onwards, and then Jacob, I know you're on standby to play it for everybody. So Anita, take a couple more moments if you wish.
Thank you, Evan. So this study from MIDEQ we conducted in one district where we spoke to around 125 children. So we used participatory method. As you can see, the girls are drawing about their dreams and aspirations and talking about where migration fits, why migration of their parents fits into the whole picture. Can we go to the next slide, Evan? So this one is about the body map, where we discussed with both male and female students of different age, of different grades about, we use a body map to understand their ideas about what is going in a girl's head when her father has migrated. What does she have to hear? What would she like to hear? What are her anxieties and fears? And what does she feel happy about where she goes? So basically, this was a body mapping done with 125 children. So that's where, so the animation that Heaven is going to show next comes from the analysis of these data from the MIDEQ research. Thank you, Heaven. This is it from me for now.
Thank you, Anita. I'll stop sharing my screen so that Jacob can show you the animation. I'd just like to say I've really enjoyed watching the process of this animation evolve from the research in Nepal. A big thanks to Ben Dix, who I know is in the background listening to us today. Ben is the founder and executive director of Positive Negatives, and we've really enjoyed this work that we're doing together. So I think, Jacob, if you'd like to share the animation.
The boy with more. Sometimes, when I'm studying for an exam, my mind wanders. I think back to a few years ago, before my dad moved to Malaysia for work. Back then, our roof leaked every monsoon. My grandma wasn't well. The doctors suggested treatment in Kathmandu, but we didn't have the money. And I didn't have a laptop to work on, like my friend had. Then, my dad started sending us money, and we could get more things. Like a waterproof roof, treatment and good medicine for grandma, my very own laptop, and a new bicycle to ride to my new English-speaking school. Some people think that since my dad migrated, I've got more things. And in some ways, I suppose it's true. I have got more things they can see. But I also have more things that they can't see, like worries. I worry my dad will get hurt in his construction job. He always says he's fine, but he works on huge buildings, and you hear about people getting hurt, or worse. And I worry that he pays for my schooling, but he can't really be part of it. I also worry what other people say about me and my family. I see them watching and whispering. Some think that, without a father watching over us, my mom and sister will be spoiled, and I'll be out of control. We would never, but when you hear rumors spreading, it gets to you. Then there's my friends who keep pushing me to pay for flash parties. But I can't, because we have to pay back the moneylenders or they'll take our home. And there's my cousin, Pratik. He had a hard time when his dad left, and now he hangs out with the drug dealers gang. I wish things could be different. I wish that someone would look out for boys like Pratik to stop them getting into drugs. And that I could talk to my teacher about friends bugging me. And that the elders would help people understand that my family is still being good, even without dad around. And that he could stay in touch with my school, maybe through an app, like my friend's dad. Hopefully, in the future, things will be better. If I do well in my studies, I could become a doctor, have fewer worries, and do more good. But before all that, I need to pass my exam today. So I'll try and focus on that. You know, I'm not worried about the exam, just the result. Okay, here I go. Wish me luck.
The link, I think, is going to be put in the chat, so you'll be able to click on it and watch it yourself and share it, hopefully, with your colleagues. So thanks again to Positive Negatives. Thanks again to Anita for her presentation. We're going to turn now to Burkina Faso. And we are going to hear from Gabriel Sangli, who is a researcher at the Higher Institute of Population Studies in Burkina Faso. Gabriel, I think, is a demographer by training, but he's also the researcher on children and inequality for MIDEQ in the Burkina Faso Côte d'Ivoire corridor. Gabriel, we're very delighted to have you with us. You've got 10 minutes for your presentation, and I'm very happy to share that now if you would like me to.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, everyone. Can you send a slide, please? Okay.
Okay, the screen is yours.
According to Burkina Faso, we have to show you an experience of stay-back children. And slide, please. Here are 7 short points we have to discuss. And in this point, we are going from context to the conclusion that shows that children are stay back, not left behind. Please, slide. In our context, we have yes, in the context of Burkina Faso, rural and commercial migration between Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso took another dimension during the colonial period. Colonial servitudes, capitation tax, compulsory crops, labor requisition, export, and development program accelerated labor migration from the 1980s onwards. The liberalization of the labor market and the abolition in 1946 of forced labor and indigenous code encouraged migration between the two countries. In the aftermath of independences, the national authorities took charge of the management of migration, sometimes to facilitating through agreements between states, sometimes by raising the level of conference. Slides, please. About children left behind, we are talking about situation of children commonly referred as left behind. In French, they call it enfants laissés pour compte. At least one of their biological parents has migrated. Some children are returnees between those who call children left behind. Are they really abandoned? It is important to identify the place of left behind children in social relations between Burkina Faso immigrants in Côte d'Ivoire and the foster families of their children stayed back home. Slide, please. Here is the perceptions about left behind children. 1/8 of household with left behind in the family said, why not treat them the same? They all belongs to me. Biological parents, certainly, but also on extensive social network. That there is the words of some of the household chief. He said, you have a biological dad, but you can't have just one dad. You have little dad. That means the younger brother of the biological father, big dads, the older brothers of the biological fathers, who stayed with you were with you here. in the country of origin, they say. If it is the little one or the grandpa who stayed at home here, he is the one who will take care of you. He is the one who will take care of your school. If we say to come to take the report cards to school, he who will take care to the cards. Slide, please. According to the reason why children are left behind, one of the participants left behind said, I wanted to follow them, his parents, when they lived in Cote d'Ivoire, but they didn't accept. The parents told me to stay here to study. And another one said, the father, said to stay here to go to school and help my mother to help her at home. And one girl left behind said, as he were all here in Cote d'Ivoire, the grandmother asked to one of the children come to stay with her, and that's how my father decided that I would come and stay with her. Slide, please. Then there a keep in touch between household and migrants. And one head of household farmer said, I have the contact. They call regularly. They call to ask about the family. I too, being here, often call them for help. The problem I can solve, I call them to ask for support. And the other one, a girl student left behind said, yes, when my uncle called them, I enjoy exchanging with them. And another one left behind said, my dad came in 2016 to see us. He paid for shoes to share with family, coats, women, and neighbors. Please. There is remittances too. And according to remittances, one head of house said, their dad send money often. If it is a complicated problem, when I call, they contribute. We received by phone only, as there are orange money. It is the means to send money to them by phone. And the other one said, left behind, it's my dad who paid my schooling. He is the one who sent money for me, for it. Slide, please. And here is the way money is used. 45.9% household receive money for children school fees. Then comes down 40% who are used to need the help of the family, and so on. And the words are, I save the money to take care of the family as his child is with me here. The fact that they were here, they helps me. They send money to my little dad, and they pay my registration fees, my outlook, and also. Slide, please. Slide, okay. Here is the conclusion that says that stay for schooling is often associated with assistance part of the household or family remaining in the country. Biological parents are not the only caregivers to children stay back. The child who remains in the country of departure is the reference point for migrant parents, thus promoting the maintenance of links with the child foster household. Frequent keeps in touch by telephone and country visit, plus migration remittances, don't ties links between the two sides. This translocalization highlights the multiple links between the area of departure and the migrants who are outside. Stay-back children remain one of the vectors of this connectivity between migrants and their background. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. You were perfectly on time. And I think, I mean, your presentation really captures some of the complexity of family relationships that are often ignored. I really find this idea of a little dad and a big dad a very interesting way of thinking about the very different roles that people take on. And I think in the report where you have that case study entitled "One Hand Does Not Pick Up Flour," I think that's a very powerful case study to sort of demonstrate the kind of communal resource that households share responsibility for labor, but also for care. I think it's a very powerful example, including in relation to cross-border parenting, which we'll hear more about from Rowan shortly. So thank you, Gabriel. We really appreciate your contribution, and to the report as well as to this roundtable. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We're moving now, I think, to Meron, if I'm right, in the agenda. Meron, it's a real pleasure to have you with us. You'll gather, dear audience, that we in MIDEQ have very different contexts. We actually have 12 countries altogether in the project, and we're giving you in this roundtable a kind of flavor of the differences of the research in different contexts. So I'd like to welcome now Dr. Meron Deleke, who is Associate Professor at the Center for Human Rights in Addis in Ethiopia. Meron works, so you can explain for yourself, I'm sure, but works on a wide range of migration topics, including gender, religion, conflict resolution, and has worked in a large number of institutes around the world and has published extensively. Meron is also one of our researchers on the childhood inequalities in migration theme in MIDEQ, and she works specifically in the Ethiopia-South Africa corridor. Meron, it's a pleasure to have you with us. You have 10 minutes and the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Heaven, and thank you all for joining us. Well, I will be speaking mainly about children's agency in migration, and one of the main arguments that we make in the discussion paper is the need to pay attention to the agency of children in migration research. The dominant discourse on child migration often portrays children as passive group whose migration trajectories are highly defined by that of adults. And such a focus about adult migration has overshadowed the agency of children, the agency of young migrants, especially that of those who stay behind. Furthermore, there is also a presumption that children coming from migrant households, who are often called children left behind, are stationed in a place and that they are not moving. And this presumption somehow is behind the notion of children left behind, the concept that we contend in the discussion paper. And one of the migration corridors for the MIDEQ research project, as Heaven has just mentioned, is the Ethiopia-South Africa corridor. And in our study in Ethiopia, we focus mainly on the southern part of the country, which is the place of origin of most Ethiopian migrants who are destined to the Republic of South Africa. And we mainly focused on one administrative zone called Hadia, which is also identified by the IOM as one of the hotspots for child migration in Ethiopia, in a study which was done in 2019-20, which I was also part of. And we did extensive ethnographic study. I'm an anthropologist by training, and also we have people from different disciplines in the team. And we did extensive ethnographic study in Hadia zone from 2019 until now. It's an ongoing research. And as a way of understanding the migration dynamics of children who stay behind, we conducted in-depth interviews, we did focus group discussion. And apart from that, we also did kind of observation of these children in their natural environment, just to have a contextualized kind of understanding. And we did interviews in 2 sites, in Hosanna, which is a zonal capital, and in Addis Ababa, which is a federal capital. And these are places we selected mainly because we were following the stories of children on the move, children coming from migrant households, those who are staying back, but who have decided to migrate to South Africa. And children's experiences in Hadiyah are far from the normative globalized ideals of childhood, whereby, as we all know, childhood in the literature is perceived as a period of dependency, a period of education, play, and leisure. Under such westernized perception of childhood, the ideal and legitimate place for child growth and development are considered to be the nuclear family and the school. But migration of children from the Hadiyah zone destined to South Africa somehow goes against this underlying presumption, and it's mostly happening at a very young age, between the ages of 13 to 17. And most child migrants are school dropouts. And in Hadiyah zone, migrant parents, mainly I'm here referring to those who have migrated to the Republic of South Africa, because our focus is on the South-South migration. And these migrant parents produce a greater opportunity for education of their children who stay back through remittances. There is also high investment on education by the diaspora. So we have a growth of private schools in Hadiyah zone. And despite such increased educational opportunities, most children who are staying behind aspire to migrate. And as the case of Nepal, we also did dream mapping, or what we call life aspiration mapping, of children who stay behind. And what we did was we basically asked school-aged young children to share their life dreams. And we just posed this question of what they aspire to be and when they grow up. And the data collected from both primary and secondary schools through the Dream Mapping project shows that large number of children from the zone aspire to migrate. And this is regardless of their family's migration history, but the interest or this dream of migrating tends to be higher for those children coming from migrant households. And most of those child migrants, but when I say child migrants here, I'm just basically referring to the children whose migration journey we were following up in our study. And these children are mostly school dropouts. About 78% of them were enrolled in primary school, while 10% of them were in high school, and only 2% did not have never been to school. So when we look at the routes these children follow to reach the Republic of South Africa, they cross different transit countries, countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe before reaching the Republic of South Africa. These are not the only transit points. There are also internal transit stops in Ethiopia and bigger cities like Addis Ababa and Hawassa. And in most circumstances, they use local brokers. These local brokers are brokers who have network with brokers in different transit countries and also in South Africa, the final destination. One of the key characteristics of child migration from Hadiyah zone is its gendered pattern. Most female child migrants from the area are often eastbound, so they mostly go to the Gulf and to the Middle East, while the male children are the ones who are mostly traveling to South Africa. And the finding of the study also clearly shows that young child migrants from Hadiyah are compelled to live by different sets of factors. And one of these factors include the deep ingrained culture of migration in the area. And this culture of migration in Hadiyah relates to the long-standing migration history from Hadiyah. Decisions about migration of a family member are often rooted in everyday experiences, which are underpinned by predominantly societal positive view toward this migration. Other contingent factors affecting the migration dynamics include availability of smuggling service and also accessibility of information technology better than the first generation of migrants. Most children consulted during the course of our study mentioned leaving their birth village without consulting a family member and making the decision to live on their own. Only few of those whom we have interviewed mentioned that they consulted one of their parents or both. And at this point, I think it's one of the essential questions that needs to be addressed is the question on why children make this unilateral decision. There are two factors that we identified through the study. The first is the fear of interception and this high-level parental authority. Even if their parents are not around or the caregivers are not around, there is this fear of interception of the migration project, and they decide to keep it to themselves. The second factor is related to the low or no expectation children have from their respective families. The very decision of involving parents in the migration project and informing them or not is made by the prospective child migrants. This calls for questioning the dominant held perception about childhood and decision-making in migration. Another way of comprehending the agency of children is from the ways in which children negotiate with their parents and family members. They often actively negotiate with their family. For example, from the data we have, at times they put pressure on their parents to sell assets to cover for the migration cost. There are cases whereby children threaten their parents of self-harm, like committing suicide as a way of putting pressure and convincing their family. And other children settle for plan B, which is they try to negotiate with their parents to asking them to buy them motorcycle or to give them some startup capital to start small business with the aim of generating income which they can use to finance their migration journey at a later stage. Some children, on the other hand, resort to internal migration, and most of the child migrants involved in the study took the decision to migrate to Addis Ababa and Hawassa, Hosanna, on their own and to work and to earn an income. And they are mostly working as shoe shiners, washing cars and as street vendors. Even though the income they earn from such jobs is not enough to pay for their migration expense, this gives them the chance to gather more information and establish a network with other potential child migrants. There are cases whereby children also make the decision to live in groups and co-migrate. So, and when they do this co-migration, this grants them a kind of sense of safety. And this also shows another instance of agency in decision-making process whereby they weigh the value of living in groups as a risk minimizing strategy. So the case material from Ethiopia included in the discussion paper and also the finding of our study, which draws on the ethnographic study, clearly shows, there is a lot to look into in terms of understanding the agency of the children, not only in decision-making, and also the fact that children who are staying back are more than children who are just left behind. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Maren. I thought that was, your contribution to the paper is incredibly interesting, but also your presentation now. I think that the points that really strike me is the gendered nature of these processes, because you've described gender as being central to what happens. So has Anita. I think that this is a very recurrent theme in the paper. Obviously, the agency of children in decision making, which is often ignored, but also it occurred to me when you were speaking that what tends to happen in the policy space is we tend to separate out policy measures aimed at children who migrate and then children left behind. But in fact, there is clearly a continuum between those children who are staying back in a household and their propensity to migrate at some stage, in part potentially because they've witnessed others in the household migrating. So I think it really challenges this separation of children into different categories that perhaps is a little problematic. So thank you very much for your contribution. And I'm sure I've already seen there's one question for you coming up, but we'll return to that after we've had the final presentation. And just to remind you all, the audience, to if you have any questions or comments for our panelists, you can drop them in the Q&A box. We have one already. And after we've had the presentation, the next and final presentation, we'll come back to those questions and put them to our panelists. So we'll just finish now by introducing, last but not least, Rowan Ribat, who is a senior researcher at the Information and Research Center of the King Hussein Foundation based in Amman in Jordan. Rowan, like all of our speakers, has very extensive experience of policy research in the region, and she is also leading MIDEQ's research in the Egypt-Jordan corridor. So Rowan, we're very happy to have you here. I think you have some slides which you will share. You have 10 minutes for your presentation, and we're very much looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Heaven, and thank you for UNU-CPR to organize this session. I'm gonna share my slides. Can you see now?
We can. Just change the mode and then we won't see your notes.
Okay, let me try again.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I've started the clock again. You're fine.
Yeah, it's work.
It's perfect. Thank you.
So before I go in deep, let me give you a bit of background about the Egyptian migrant context. So Egyptian labor migration to other Arab countries started in the mid of 1970s, and the major destination was Gulf countries, Jordan, Libya, and Iraq. Currently, Jordan have the largest number of Egyptian labor migrants, second only to Saudi Arabia. The majority of Egyptian migrants who travel to Jordan are male, especially semi-skilled men who migrate alone. And this led us to the next question: why the children stay back? So there are two factors or reasons regarding this question. The first point is socioeconomic factors. So the high cost of living and healthcare in Jordan compared to Egypt. Also disparity in the exchange rates between the two countries. Challenges associated with working conditions and housing conditions. They often reside in poor conditions and shared housing with other migrant workers. And due to this point, sometimes family, I mean wife and children, choose not or decide not to migrate. And also due the feeling to stay far from the extended family and the community, a feeling of homesick or mental stability, they make decide because that. And there is also a policy factors. So Jordan restrict Egyptian workers from taking their families or visiting them in Jordan with strict requirements, such as registration with the Social Security Corporation, earning monthly income exceeding about $500, or holding an investor card. Moreover, workers in some sectors were excluded from allowing their families to visit, especially agriculture, where most Egyptian migrants work in this sector, cleaning, loading and unloading sector. Even if these conditions are met, the Jordanian authorities retain discretionary power to deny entry to the worker's family. Now I'm going quickly through this slide. I just want to confirm of what my colleagues mentioned before. We have a common ground, even if we talk about different contexts and different countries. Left behind refers, what's the problem with the left behind term in Egyptian context? Left behind refers to the state of abandonment and separation from the family, including wives and children. In many cases, these children live in extended families or close-knit communities, which provide them with care and support. Also, this concept ignores the social and the cultural context in which migration occurs in Egypt. And it's also important to highlight that in some area in Egypt, it's common for every household to have experienced the migration of male family member, typically the father or husband, or older brothers. Now I just want to focus on points of parenting across borders. Egyptian migrants who go to Jordan don't see their migration as abandoning their children, and their children don't view it that way either. In fact, their aspirations are often centered around their children who stay back, such as building a house for their children, preparing daughters for marriage. Migration also brings economic benefits, as fathers can send remittances to improve their family's financial situation. They allow them to provide private education for kids, better food and healthcare, leading to an overall improved quality of life. And the girls who's interviewed in this research talk about responding to their daily needs and requests because their fathers work abroad, unlike the other girls whose fathers didn't migrate. Some fathers also say that they migrate for securing the kids' future, and retaining to their children and family is their most important future aspiration. Now let's talk about communication technology and how it's playing a significant role in long-distance parenting. Egyptian migrants in Jordan maintain not just, as I said, exchange goods and remittances, but also constant communication with their children, given the availability of various methods of communication like social media and smartphone and so on. And when fathers maintain regular communication and remain actively involved in their children's life, despite the distance, it can have a positive impact on the children's emotional well-being. And this constant connection allows children to maintain a sense of security and reassurance. And some people directly stated that video calls make fathers present in the home most of the time, and this thing that wasn't there in like 15 years ago, which make the feeling of absence impactful more in the past. So we could say that regular communication bridges the gap between parents and child, enabling children to share their experiences and seek guidance, which contributes to their overall emotional resilience. If I want to talk about entrance into adulthood roles and agency, in the absence of their fathers, children, especially older sons, often become the primary support for their families. They set up to assist their mothers with household chores, take care of younger siblings, and handling day-to-day tasks that were traditionally done by the father. And this shift in responsibilities goes beyond typical childhood roles. And these young individuals demonstrate remarkable maturity and adaptability in the face of their father's absence. It's important to note that that the children who stayed back were not passive in the migrant process. On the contrary, assuming these roles and responsibilities actually enhanced their independence and ability to communicate with others. And this highlights the resilience and agency of both the children and their migrant parents. So for example, they participate in social events on behalf of their fathers, like attend wedding or so on. In conclusion, I want to say, understanding children's engagement with parental presence and absence highlights their agency in coping with the consequences of migration. It emphasized the significance of fostering open communication and support system that facilitate a positive experience for children during their father's absence. I'm gonna stop here and going back to you, Heben. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowan, again for covering a lot of different issues in a really concise and precise way. I was really struck by your initial opening remark about the way in which, ultimately governments and institutions set the scene, if you like, for the ability or otherwise of children to travel with their parents. I think, Anita, you also mentioned that in your presentation, that when migrants are traveling to the Gulf states, for example, they're not allowed to take their children with them. And I know in the paper we talk about the fact that even if it's possible, the conditions in which migrants are working often make it very difficult because of the quality of the housing and the long working hours, etc. So I think that's a really important contextual point that takes us out of the household and into the state in a way. And I think your point about technology is also very important. In the paper, there are multiple examples from each of you about the changing role of technology in facilitating conversations between parents and children. And we saw in the animation, this desire of children to be connected with their parents, even if only remotely, through an app or similar, or through WhatsApp, if nothing else, or WeChat, or whatever other possibilities there are. So I think you've all raised in your presentation a huge number of different issues. We've got about 20 minutes now to have some discussion or some comments, some questions from our audience. We've got 3 questions at the moment, and they're directed. One question is directed to all of you, and then we have a question from Meron and a question to Anita. I'm sure you can see them, but for the benefit of the audience, I'll just read them out. And let's start with the question first to Anita. And I'll also ask you, Anita, to respond to the general question that's been asked. So Talina Adisu says, Anita, given the current trend in migrants, mostly males, is there a differential impact on male and female children when it comes to the positive impacts? So that's a question specifically for you, Anita. And then there's a general question to everybody, which you could answer perhaps at the same time, which is how did the investment of migration remittances into livelihood activities in places of origin, including in climate adaptive practices, impact children who stayed behind? Were there any positive or negatives you observed through your research? And I think, Gabrielle, that very much speaks to your points about remittances in particular. And then the final question is to Meron. Thank you for the insightful presentation. What was the reason behind the different destinations pursued by girls to the Gulf region and boys to South Africa? Did their migration to these destinations take place through different pathways, e.g., or i.e. legal or versus illegal? So let's come to you first, Anita, with that question about the gendered impacts, particularly the positive impacts on male and female children, then to you, Meron, and then we'll go to everybody with that question about remittances. Anita.
Thank you very much, Evan. So I'll answer the first question first on the gendered impact. A bit of a background to those of you who do not know Nepal Nepal is a very diverse country. There are more than 100 ethnic groups. So the practice is very different. It's very gendered. In some groups, they are very gender discriminatory. In some groups, they are not so gender discriminatory. So in groups where there is a lot of gender discrimination, there are harmful traditional practices like early marriage and dowry system. And early marriage often leads to girls dropping out of school earlier and less investment on girls' education. So the positive impact that we have seen over the years for female children, where male migration, where the father's migration is high, or in general, even when the mother migrates, is the fact that there's more investment in the girls' education compared to earlier. So whenever there is given the importance that is placed on son in our society in general, and in these societies where there's also like sex selective abortion is also very high, it shows that sons are more important for the family. So in those kind of societies, in those kind of groups, we are seeing that parents, when they've migrated abroad, they tend to invest a bit more in their girls' education than they used to do before. So that's one positive impact. But then the other thing is also, most of the time, the idea is you get your daughter married while you are still earning abroad, because there is also a dowry system in these areas, which means that you want to pay off the dowry while you are working, which means that it also increases early marriage. When we when we did this research around what do people invest in those provinces where dowry system is very high, dowry comes as the second most important investment of migration, of remittances, which means that it also leads to early marriage and perpetuation of the dowry system. So there are one, investment in education is high, but then also the girls are being taken out of school much earlier. So the kind of, the overall impact then is not so much different for the girls.
Thanks, Anita. I mean, that's a very important reminder of the different patriarchal context within which migration takes place. Patriarchy exists everywhere, but it doesn't necessarily take the same form. And I think that really contextualizes the impacts. And as you say, so many different groups, you can't necessarily generalize, but that's very helpful. Meron, can I go to you next in terms of that question that was directed to you? And then I'm going to come to Rowan with a following question. Actually, just been reminded that question was for everybody. So we'll come to the question about remittances in a moment, but let's first go to Meron to ask the question about gender again, but this time in relation to the Gulf versus South Africa.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, actually, I did not make this reference to a common saying in the area which explains this gendered nature. It's an Amharic saying. It goes like "Setoch le Dabub, Setoch le Dubai, Wendoch le Dabub," which literally translates are girls are meant for Dubai while men are meant for Dabub is South. So it has become, part of like the everyday communication in a way. I mean, it's highly ingrained. And when coming to the reason of why, I think there are two main reasons that we need to pay attention to. One is the nature of the labor market at places of destination. That's in the Gulf, it's basically, about domestic work, and this is the domestic care business that they are going to be engaged in. So the labor demand at the place of destination is one of the factors that shapes the gendered nature of the migration. In South Africa, I mean, it's mostly this the informal trade that men are involved in. And so that's one factor. And the second factor is the risks involved in the whole migration process. Well, both are, I mean, the kind of migration we are looking at is so-called irregular migration. And I mean, I don't want to use the term illegal here, but it's the irregular migration that, that we are following up. And in both cases, I mean, there are risks involved, but the risk tends to be more in this route in the southern route, because they are crossing different, as I've said, different transit countries. So these two reasons, the nature of the job market at the place of destination and also the risk involved are somehow shaping the gendered nature. But here I also want to make the point that, you know, it doesn't mean that girls are not migrating to South Africa. We also have cases where, you know, there is this arranged marriage practice whereby older men from the place of origin are looking for younger wives. And in this case, there is this arranged marriage going on. And here we are looking at how this migration is reinforcing harmful traditional practices, specifically referring to early marriage in the context of Southern Ethiopia. So I hope I've addressed your question. Thank you.
You have indeed. Thank you very much, Meron. That's very helpful. Gabriel, could I come to you next and just ask you to address this question about the investment of migration remittances into livelihood activities? You talked a little bit in your presentation about the investment in education. Are there also investments in kind of climate adaptive practices, in changing agricultural practices in Burkina Faso? Anything that you've observed in your research that you can tell us about that might benefit children?
Okay. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you for the questions. What we said is that can we call it investment? It is the use of the remittances. And this use of remittances are in the social fellow, mainly. Schooling first, health after, third rank is food, and the other one is social events. Then there is just a small part for investment. This is why we cannot say that it is about it is an investment. Yes, it is. It helps family to solve some problems in the society, just like that.
Understood. And it's very interesting that in that hierarchy of priorities that you just gave us, education or schooling was at the top, even above, you know, other things like food and health. So, and in fact, in all of the case studies here that we've been talking about, education over and over again appears to be a top priority in terms of the spending of remittances. So when we think about stay back children and the consequences of migration, that seems to me to be a very significant benefit, if we want to call it that, in terms of children's educational achievements, albeit that it then of course creates inequalities between children in terms of those who are in migrant households and have those opportunities and others who don't. So I think that's an interesting additional layer to think about. Thank you, Gabriel. Rawan, could I just direct the question specifically to you about the Egyptian context? You said that children do not feel like they were left behind. Is this true for children of all age groups? For example, perhaps younger children won't see the sacrifice their parents are making and the positive outcome. So we haven't talked about age differentials, but maybe there's a difference between how 5 or 6 year olds see migration and their parents' absence compared to a teenager who's benefiting from schooling. Is that something you found in your research, Rawan?
Thank you. I think all ages mentioned that they understand why their parents migrant. So, or why they leave. So they realize that even though they of course they miss them, and especially on the occasion like Eid and so on, but they understand that, because they are better off, and it's become a benefit. So they understand the absence. All ages, I think they accept on that. I don't know if.
Thanks, Rawan. I think we'll come to Anita on this, but I'm guessing, in any household, including households where families are working very long hours, even who've not migrated, that there are negotiations and discussions that go on within the household to explain to children, the nature of the parenting relationship. So in some ways it's no different. But Anita, did you want to come in on that point?
Yes, Evan, on the previous point about, adaptation, like climate change adaptation, I mean, it's not specifically focused on children, but I also understood from the question that you are not asking directly related to children. But most of the time, one of the important investment of migration is also in building a sturdy house. So in Nepal, that would be, converting your mud thatch house into a concrete, like a cement house with a tin, and relocating, like buying land, which means that you relocate from a place that is near the river or that is prone to flood to a more safer places. So it's not direct per children, but the idea is also general well-being of the family. And then if the house is in an unsafe place or if the house is not sturdy, then there's the investment on making that house sturdy. So that means that this also has then positive impact in terms of, like, reducing the risk of vulnerability from natural disasters on children as well.
Thank you, Anita. That's a very important point. And any of us who've worked in contexts where there are migrant diaspora who are sending back money into communities know that you can often visually see quite dramatic differences in housing quality between those who have families abroad who are sending remittances and the investment that goes into property. I think that's quite clear in many migratory contexts. We're going to move on in a minute to the policy implications. We've just got one more. It's more of an observation than a question. This participant says, an important insight from the research presented seems to be that while it's important to acknowledge children's agency and to move away from framing them as passive or left behind, this agency needs to be interpreted through an intersectional lens that recognizes this agency may nonetheless be constrained to varying levels by prevailing structures and institutions that affect different children differently. And I think that's a very astute observation, absolutely hits the nail on the head, so to speak. That's absolutely right, that what we're not saying is categorically, that all children benefit from migration or that this is inherently a positive process. I think what we're saying is, firstly, that it's happening and we need to acknowledge that. And I don't think anybody is going to be able to easily prevent it because it's such a driver of families' desire to improve outcomes for their households and for their children. But secondly, that the context and the circumstances under which that migration happens can make huge differences to the ability of children to adapt and benefit from it. And I think that takes us really very neatly on to our next and final speaker, actually. So we'll close off the questions, but we'll come back for a discussion after we've heard now from Daniela Knopik, who works at UNICEF's Global Program and Migration Hub in Geneva, across a sectoral section which provides technical support to strengthen individual components of mobility, migration or asylum systems, and their interaction as well as their relationships with the other child critical systems to ensure a continuum of protection and services. And Daniela leads the work on strengthening inclusion of children affected by migration in social protection and health systems, as well as leading UNICEF's engagement in the 2023 Global Refugee Forum, which of course is taking place in Geneva in December. And prior to joining UNICEF, Daniela worked on refugee protection with UNHCR offices in Tanzania and South Africa, as well as a refugee integration project with the German Red Cross. Daniela, we're really delighted that UNICEF is represented at this event and that you've been able to join us. We'd really like to hear from you about the thinking within UNICEF already about some of these concepts that we're discussing, and really your reaction to some of the research that we have published today. The floor is yours, or the screen is yours. Thank you, Daniela.
Thank you so much, Evan, and really nice to be here. I'm delighted to make an intervention on behalf of UNICEF, and first would like to obviously congratulate you for the publication of this discussion paper. And I think it's filling a very important knowledge and evidence gap that we see, because a lot of times when we are speaking about children affected by migration, research and evidence is focused on migrant children, displaced children, and less so on children that are staying back. And I want to use this opportunity to pick up on some of the findings of the paper and the presentations, and then highlight some of our UNICEF interventions and asks to governments and the private sectors. And I'm going to be picking up, I think, one recurring theme that we've heard throughout the presentations. And I think speakers have done a fantastic job in presenting just how varied and nuanced the experience of children that are staying back can be. And one thing that struck me quite a bit in the paper was really looking at gendered impacts. So looking at two examples that weren't highlighted yet is the research that is coming out of Ghana that was highlighted in the paper, and really suggesting that parental migration can lead to increased domestic work and changes in care arrangements that particularly affect girl children. But then at the same time, the paper, I think, also looked at how the experience of girls in Mexico was, for example, quite different, where when family members migrated, households would actually tend to favor girls in investment. So I think that was something very, very interesting coming out of the research. And then secondly, before going a bit into sort of forward-looking or asks and the UNICEF work, I think another important factor that I wanted to highlight was really looking at parents' migration status. So we've also seen in the paper that in many contexts, there continue to exist very few opportunities for undocumented migrants to regularize their stay, and all the implications that brings in terms of not just bringing themselves into high-risk situations, anything from detainment to deportation, but also the disruptance of remittances and the impact that can have on the families that sometimes very highly depend on remittances. So now when we're turning sort of to the question of what is needed to strengthen protection and access to services for stay-back children, I think what is central is that as we are looking at policy discussions on labor migration, on migration management, is that we are putting the safeguarding of the rights of children of migrant workers at the center of these discussions. So at UNICEF, we are working to, first of all, support parents and communities when it comes to establishing a continuum of care to help children achieve healthy psychosocial developments, looking at how we can facilitate continued contact between parents and children, and do that in the support of the broader community. And then also, very importantly, looking at the role that different service providers, and we've heard some thoughts on this already, can play when it comes to making sure that children receive support and the protection that they need. So what are some of our key asks? So when we're first looking at governments as key stakeholders, it is really encouraging to work with agencies like UNICEF, but also local and community-based organizations when it comes to strengthening child protection systems to really ensure that specific protection needs of children of migrant workers are met. And this includes, for example, also ensuring that social service workers are equipped to check in on stay-back children, that they're aware of what are some of the specific challenges that they may face. And I think we've really had a very interesting and nuanced insight through the clip that we were watching into what this could look like. And then secondly, also looking at formalizing guardianship arrangements in the absence of parents. And there's a really interesting practice that I would like to highlight from UNICEF's work in Kyrgyzstan, where under an EU-funded multi-country project, we have really worked together with the government to look at strengthening child protection systems for children. And with regards to formalizing legal guardianship, really looking at a three-step process. And here the focus was looking at providing a mechanism whereby parents that are leaving children for an extended period of time can fill out a mandatory temporary guardianship declaration that appoints a temporary guardian in their absence, which is really key to make sure that children can continue to access important services, including, for example, child allowances. And another important aspect of this intervention or program was really looking at capacitating other service providers to identify and refer children without parental care to the relevant family and child support departments. And this brings me to another point, which is really looking at strengthening multi-sectoral services and approaches. So this includes capacitating, engaging with social service workers, community nurses. We've heard about the role that teachers can play to make sure that children have the opportunity to stay in school, that they're engaged in learning, are healthy, and have access to services. And one area of focus for UNICEF looks at strengthening the inclusion of all children, regardless of their migration status, their parents' migration status, into social protection programming, and really looking at how we can capacitate and build up national systems and advocate for universal child benefits. Because one challenge that we've identified is that children that are staying back are often excluded from social service programs because they receive remittances. And while often remittances can help families privately fund certain services, they are not a substitute for social protection measures, and they're also highly unpredictable and can be highly highly intermittent. And then moving obviously to the key role that government needs to play is really protecting the right to family unity by looking at providing regular channels for migration that allow families to travel together, to develop temporary work programs where migrants are permitted to regularly return to their families or allow children to visit their migrating parents. And then when we're looking, for example, at the negotiation of bilateral labor migration agreements, it is key that children's rights and best interests should be included in those negotiations, should be a central factor impacting those negotiations, and that child rights agencies are a key stakeholder being present and shaping those bilateral labor agreements. And then I think one point that we've also heard today, and with this paper providing a fantastic contribution, is that we need more data and research to inform our solutions. This includes, for example, also investing in longitudinal data to look at the social impact of labor migration, or really looking at how we can strengthen the evidence base that we have that is particularly looking at data on undocumented seasonal migration. And then maybe turning it to the second big stakeholder I would like to talk about is the role of the private sector. So I think we all know that the private sector has an important role to play when it comes to creating those conditions that support migrant workers so that they are able to maintain relationships with their children and ensure that, for example, remittances are transferred at minimum costs. And here UNICEF's guidance really is to companies on supporting children's rights as part of their corporate responsibility. So businesses providing the working conditions that support workers in their role as parents and as caregivers, and also considering how children's rights and best interests in their contracts are reflected in their contracts and the work conditions. And the ILO have done some fantastic work around really encouraging the sharing of responsibility between both states and employers, and really making them or encouraging them to enable those work-family reconciliation in the context of migration by adopting the notion of what is called the social co-responsibility. And some of the recommendations here are really, picking up of some of the recommendations that we've already heard throughout the webinar, looking, for example, at facilitating the return and reintegration of migrant workers to prevent remigration. Then reducing, of course, regulatory barriers to opportunities for families to reunite, and making employers also co-responsible for the protection of the legal rights of working parents. And then I think one aspect to really highlight also lastly is looking at reducing the cost of remittances, and that this is actually ingrained in our SDG targets, which calls for reducing the transaction cost of remittances to less than 3% by 2030. And I think when we're looking at where we are currently with the data, there's quite a lot of room left. But with that, maybe let me hand it back to the organizers, and thank you again for this really important piece of work.
Thank you very much, Daniela. That's a very helpful intervention. I love that you're using the term "stay back" and not "left behind." So that feels like a great step. I know there's been some moves within UNICEF for some time on this one because you've recognized, but I think it's just it's habitually how it's come to be referenced. I think what's very interesting is many of your policy kind of suggestions and proposals are very much aligned with ours. This idea of strengthening support for children who stay back, obligations that states have. I mean, all states, with the exception of 2 states, have obligations under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, seeing staying back as being a vulnerability factor as well as potentially an opportunity for children. As you say, not assuming that children who stay back are privileged by virtue of remittances, but also that they can be vulnerable in different ways depending on context. And the big point that I think underpins all of this, changing the possibilities and opportunities for families to stay united, even if there's migration, there's possibility of families becoming connected through visitation opportunities, etc. And as long as people remain undocumented and irregular, that is almost impossible. And what is happening is that private sector employers are effectively benefiting from migrant workers without bearing any of the costs of social reproduction, because of course, within a family unit, normally there would be those costs. So I think there is, as you say, a really important role for the private sector here, not just in terms of facilitating the possibilities of families being together, providing leave, providing family unity possibilities, but also not taking advantage of the fact that they are benefiting hugely from workers being available on call in this way because they don't have family responsibilities immediately affecting them. Really helpful. Thank you, Daniela. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those points during the discussion, and we'll certainly return to you at the end for a final comment. We've got about half an hour left. We've got some more questions and comments. I can see that the speakers are responding to some of the questions or the points that have been made, which is great. We've got a few unanswered questions. We'll maybe deal with those first before we move on to talk about the policy implications, because I suspect that the priorities from a policy point of view are going to be quite different in the different contexts that we're looking at. So let's first go to three questions, a question and three questions. And I'll open it to any of the panelists to respond. The first question comes from Veronica Hendel, which says, do you include second generations in the notion of migrant children in your case studies? I think that's an interesting question in terms of the boundaries. Gamali Todzro says, thank you for the presentations, very enriching. I'm wondering what are the development opportunities the research is charting so far? I don't know, Gamali, whether you want to add to that question in terms of whether you mean development for the children or development in the broader sense of the word, but I'd be interested to learn more about that. And a question and a comment from Kathleen Dubé, interested in this sort of positive framing. How has the potential polarized narratives fueled health fears? For example, constructed perceptions of risk, informal economy, etc. And again, with the gender dimension, you can read the question yourself, but I think it's also something about narratives. And we know from the child migration space, as you rightly said, Daniela, that these narratives are quite polarizing. They do lead different actors to operate in relation to some children, not others. There is often a vulnerability framing, a victim framing of those discussions. But I wonder whether any of the speakers, any particular order, would like to come back. You can wave at me if you want to speak or put your hand up. So Meron, would you like to respond to any of those points that have been made? Thank you.
Yeah, just to respond to the first point on the second generation of children. Well, as we have said, we actually look at places of origin and destination. And on the destination side, which is South Africa, our researchers based in South Africa are looking at these second generation children who are, born into migrant households, and how their lived experiences are quite different in terms of, integration and this cultural competence at places of destination. So we do look at that, but mainly from the aspect of places of destination.
Okay. Meron, whilst you're there, in terms of policy implications, given what you've been telling us about these, these intergenerational and very deeply connected relationships between children who stay back but then go on to move, what would, from your perspective, be the role of policymakers, whether it's local or national or international, in terms of addressing some of the issues that you've told us about?
Yeah, I think one of the issues is because we speak much about the different routes of migration, the irregular nature of the migration, and also the aspect of this migration management, migration regulations which are put in place, which somehow constrain mobility of children, and also this issue of family reunification. So those are the areas which need to be addressed in terms of what we see, because even though the assumption is that children who are staying back are sort of immobile, we see that the case from Ethiopia at least practically shows that they're on the move. So there needs to be some sort of regulatory mechanism, not in terms of constraining migration, which we see happening most of the time, but rather facilitating this form of regular family reunification process. So that's what I want to emphasize.
Thank you, Meron. I mean, I guess that reflects a broader issue within the migration space more generally, right? Which is that migration is happening under these very problematic sets of regulatory frameworks. And people are still moving, they're just being placed in positions of increased vulnerability or marginalization or inequality by virtue of the systems within which they're moving. So yes, there's a role for different actors there to address that, but also a bigger narrative framing point, which of course MIDEQ also tries to address through its research. Thank you, Meron. Gabriel, Rowan, or Anita, did you want to come back on any of the points that have been made or any of the points in the chat? Gabriel, you've come off mute, so I think you want to say something.
Yes, okay, thank you. What I want to say is that left behind, children stay back, is a symbolic. And this symbolic is about identity and socialization. It is about schooling and economic matter, exchange. And finally, a translocality, that means extension of opportunities, special opportunities between the area of origin and the area of destination for the migrant. It's to extend the space where you can exit. Coming to that, if you see the meaning of the remittances become something, a link you want to keep between the two sides. Because this link is powerful, because it is a link with the community. And this link is a community is so powerful that sometimes when you look for the money sent in the countries, the money sent for remittances are upper than those who are shared with other countries to help each other. It means that there is something too powerful. There are investments, but it's not the same. In the case of the study of children left behind, the link with remittances is different from another kind of investment. These kind are not remittances like that. This is why I want to say that at this moment, the attachment to the country of origin is something very powerful. And you cannot explain only by money. There is something, yes, who is stronger than just to give money to someone. Yes, and the other one is that there is a security situation too. From time to time, we have some experiences who shows that xenophobia comes from time to time. And you are not secured like that. But having a relationship with your background, you can keep it strongly and you can be best representative for your community than in other places. This is why I think that the place of children stay back is something active, who put in movement everyone around them. They become the focus point around which people exchange and tie links for the future. This is why I can say it at this point. And what what politicals can come to do is that, according to diasporas, those of countries who are outside, they have to support them and by protection where they are between relationships and between countries. And the other one is to make the fees of remittances low enough to let them be benefit for the populations who receive that. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Those are very helpful interventions. And I think, I mean, we know, well, the migration between Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire is huge in scale. It's historically very significant. It's, of course, a kind of free movement because of the ECOWAS region, but you still see all kinds of other kind of limitations on the circumstances under which people move. So I think it's a very good, an interesting example, as you say, of the symbolic power of migration and something that historically is very rooted in that particular context. So thank you for those observations. Anita, did you want to come in on any of the points that have been made so far, particularly in relation, I'm thinking, to the policy recommendations or implications of this work?
I think, I mean, thanks, Evan. So just a clarification on the second generation, because we are, we are looking at the place of origin, so we didn't look at second generation migrants. In terms of policy implication, one of the one of the kind of recurring policy implications we are having is the importance of having a filler, like even before when a person thinks about migrating when he has a children or when she has a children, I think it is important to make them sit and reflect on the implications that migration is going to have on the children, how they are going to manage the children, and also I think the pre-employment orientation kind of model directed at least for a few hours, if not days, that kind of helps the family to implications of migration, and I think is important. And as you know, Heaven, in the flexible funding, we are trying to do that with the spouses of the migrants, and they are finding it very, we have results now from the quant study, not fully so the quant data is not fully analyzed, but we have had qualitative interviews where the wives of the migrants have started talking to their spouse about these about the management of their children. We also have schools now developing apps for the fathers so that they can take an active participation in the study of the children, because in the even without research in the community itself, there's a growing anxiety that though the migration is so much focused on children, it's so much for the children, it's not bringing in the desired results. In fact, it's leading to more negative results for the children. So there's already some community things happening. We are trying to do it through the policy, but what we don't have so far is a policy. So that's a big gap.
Thanks, Anita. That's very interesting. And I wonder whether, I'm not sure if other people want to respond to this, but also the inequalities, I mentioned it earlier, between children in migrant and non-migrant households, because it seems to me that potentially, if we're hearing so much about the potential benefits of migration in terms of remittance, for example, in terms of education, but also in terms of general household income, what does that mean for the creation of potentially new inequalities within ascending, if you like, origin country? Might want to come back on that one. Rowan, did you want to come back in on either any of the points that are on the chat or any of the points that have been made so far about the policy implications, for example, in the context of migration from Egypt to Jordan?
Yeah, I already typed answers in the chat, but about policies, I think children in migrant families are directly impacted by regulations limiting the movement of families. So I think governments should protect the right to family unity by allowing children to visit their migrating fathers. There are agreements between Jordan and Egypt in this regard, but it should be encouraged to activate this agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowan. Yes, I think we've gone around a bit of a circle actually back to what governments can do in terms of creating the regulatory frameworks within which people can meet their obligations actually under international human rights law and under the CRC, and then create the conditions by which those realities can be come into force. Daniela, did you want to come back on anything so far? I think we've covered off some of the questions in the chat. I wondered whether you had anything to add to what you've said or heard so far.
Yeah, maybe 2 points that I was thinking of as colleagues were speaking. The one point, I know Gabriel mentioned the issue of xenophobia, and I think here it's really important that we also invest more and more in tools like social listening, social and behavior change, tools to really understand how the issue of children affected by labor migration is really seen in communities. I think we've seen such a broad spectrum of, the opportunities it brings, how children and families that are not migrating are sort of looking at children whose parents may be abroad. So I think that's really sort of an evidence gap that we still have, not just when it comes to children that are staying back, but I think in general on migration and displacement and how communities are reacting and how this may actually vary from locality to locality. So for example, UNICEF has done some research when it comes to looking at sort of public attitudes around displacement from Ukraine to Poland, and really understanding what are local buckets of sort of opinions or what is driving this narrative. And I think linked to that, a lot of the discussion, I think we've seen that recently with the EU Pact, is really still framed around security concerns. And I think we need to really move away from this discourse to put children and their rights at the center of the discussion. I think we all know that the Convention on the Rights of the Child guarantees rights to all children, regardless of their migration status, regardless of what types of services they may be receiving through remittances. And I think sort of reframing the discussion and also looking at what is the potential of migration. I think there's, especially now with when we're looking at climate and migration, so much to explore in terms of how children that are affected by climate change and likely going to move, what are some of the opportunities that we can explore with regards to that? And then secondly, I think also thinking a bit about route-based approaches, and when we're thinking of migration corridors, you mentioned, for example, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, and countries in the region, also exploring how we can strengthen sort of the continuum of care and how child protection and other services speak to each other across borders. What are opportunities to, for example, facilitate learning exchanges? We've seen a lot with regards to, for example, child protection system strengthening. I know in the chat, Kathleen mentioned the issue of child trafficking and how we can make sure that systems sort of speak to each other and children can access services, child protection, social protection across borders. These are, just two thoughts chipping in on what colleagues had already mentioned.
Thank you. I mean, I think that point about cross-border care, cross-border communication, cross-border, engagement around these issues is so important, because we've seen plenty of cross-border cooperation on security, right? But when it comes to these other kinds of issues, rather less interest in cooperating on those elements. So I think that's a really important point. And I think the other important point that you made is around rights, because it strikes me, I mean, I've worked in this area of children and migration for, well, I guess 25 years. And often what we end up doing, including as researchers, but also as advocates, is we end up highlighting the vulnerabilities of children, but at the cost of their agency, and also often not talking about rights, because as a rights-based approach, there is, as you say, a whole raft of obligations on states to uphold the rights of children. And it shouldn't be necessary always just to highlight their vulnerability and the terrible things that do happen to children in order for them to get the protection to which they're entitled and the rights to which they're entitled. So there's something about an overarching rights-based discourse that children also need to be situated in, rather than just a sort of vulnerability or victimhood framing, which I think has been often necessary in this very difficult migration political environment, to try and at least leverage some care for children, but it comes at a cost of talking about rights often. So I think there's a real balance there to be struck. Thank you, Daniela. Anita, you have your hand up.
Yes, Evan, just a small reflection. So when we think about migration, and particularly in South Asia and in Southeast Asia, in the global South, when we think about migration and protection and well-being, we are thinking either the discourse, the policy, and the kind of push, the activism is mostly towards the safety of the migrants and the well-being of the migrants. Whereas, I mean, we have increasingly been seeing that migration also affects, negatively also, the people who remain back, the families of the migrants. And this is never reflected in the policy, which means that we do not make the destination country responsible also for the well-being of the family, right? I mean, we leave the family to the migrant, we leave the welfare of the family to the migrant, or to the family, through an extended support from the extended family members. I think what is important is to bring the fact that ensuring that the well-being of the family is also not hampered. It should also be a responsibility both of the state but also of the destination country. I think that's what the policy, that's what the lens of the policy should be, at least. So I think that's also important to bring that, to bring this well-being discourse in the center, either using a rights approach, but at least ensuring that both the sending and the destination country play a very strong role in ensuring that the families are not negatively affected by migration.
Thanks, Anita. Yes, I mean, I think your work is very innovative in that regard, because as you say, the MIDEQ Hub has, I think, 33 interventions now, taking the findings of the research and trying to shift the way in which things are done. And I think your work on, either pre-departure support for migrant households, wives and children in those households, as you say, and that comes potentially at the neglect of looking at those that stay back and what the consequences, both good and bad, of that can be. So yeah, it's a kind of much more holistic approach, and it's really where MIDEQ tries to think in terms of corridors rather than just thinking only in terms of destination countries or sending countries. So I think that's a very important point. We've got about 10 minutes remaining. I think we've covered off most of the questions. There is one, I think, outstanding, which comes from Gamali. He just elaborated on his point. Broadly, he's curious about where policy development and economic situations come in to create changes for both children and parents. That's a pretty broad question, Gamali. I think we've covered off some of the answers in relation to the different contexts where we're working, which of course are very different in their characterization. But I wonder whether we could just, seeing as we've got 5 speakers, I wonder whether we could just take this last 10 minutes, give everybody 2 minutes each, very equitably distributed amongst you all, to really say whatever it is you want to say by way of conclusion as to what you would like to see happen with this paper, actually, what you would like, maybe just 1 or 2 key things that you would like to happen, both in terms of how we at UNU-CPR can take forward this research, but also in terms of how we can work with UNICEF and others to elaborate on some of the ideas that are contained within it. So you'll each have 2 minutes. Be fair to your colleagues by not being too lengthy. And we'll literally just go round in the order in which people have originally spoken and ask you to draw out some concluding remarks. So Anita, your internet has held up beautifully. We're very happy to have you with us from Bangladesh. Could you just give us your concluding observations or thoughts on what you'd like to see happen next?
Thanks, Evan. I think that Daniela already raised this. The most important thing is we have done like scattered qualitative research here and there, but we still don't have the scope, right? We in Nepal, I can say that 50% of the households are migrants, which means that even if one household has 1 child, we are talking about 50% household of children in Nepal, but we haven't been able to have a large, like a representative survey that kind of is able to show the extent of this problem. It remains neglected because it's a children's issue, and like most of the time in big development debates, when migration is concerned, children, as you know, are often like overshadowed. So I think the first thing is like having a good data collection, having a good data is important.
I think that's a really important point, and it's unfortunate that due to a very significant funding cut, the MIDEQ Hub unfortunately wasn't able to do the survey work in Nepal, because I think you're right. I think that kind of mapping of what the circumstances are, especially in a context like Nepal, where you have 50% of households with migrants abroad, it makes a lot of sense to try and get some patterns, but also some of these nuances in a more systematic way. And whenever we dig deep, we just see many more things that need to be looked at and addressed in terms of the research issues. So thank you, Anita. Data and evidence for sure. I think, Gabriel, you were next as the speaker. So what would you like to see happen next in terms of this research that we're doing?
According to me, the way we see how children left behind or stayed at home are taken in care by caregivers, I think that we cannot make a discrimination to help children like that. It is all the community we have to support, because there is some examples who some people's left behind have some problems. It's right, but the majority of those we have discussed about are in good enough, a good mood enough. But when we need to accompany them and to exclude opportunity for them to, or problems for them to work soon or to leave the school, we have to support the households and the complete way of thinking and working. And this is the best way to grow up all the children, because they are the main object of our study. We need to protect them and to make them an example of success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel. And I think that point also speaks to this idea of not of trying to avoid the kind of increased inequality between children in different households, particularly where households are operating as they are in Burkina Faso in a less individualized way, let's say that they work collaboratively, so we can harness that collaboration more effectively, I'm sure. Meron, you were the next speaker, so we'd be interested to know what you
Sure.
Yeah, I want to point out two major issues. The first one is I was mentioning about this transit space which children are crossing most of the time, and this go often unnoticed and they're out of sight because children are not also considered as a group of migrants on themselves. So for me, the point Daniela mentioned about protection or provision of protection to children also needs to somehow tailor to this transit space, both internal and external transit space. I think this is one thing which can follow up out of our research. And the second thing I would like to see happening is also having data, well-organized data. Well, it's clear that we lack data when it comes to migration research in general, but when it comes to children's migration experience, this is even more, there is more gap, and we often draw on anecdotal kind of data. So for me, the data issue and also protection provision at places of transit are quite pressing at the moment. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Meron. Very important point about transit space, because when we talk about destination and origin countries, we of course assume that there's sort of nothing in between, which there clearly is in many contexts. And your point about data, I think that's absolutely right. There has been a real burgeoning of research on child migrants, but it's almost all exclusively, not entirely, but the majority of that has been in the global north. You know, looking at migrant children in Europe, in North America, there's been really very limited research in the context of South-South migration. So I think the research that all of you are doing in the context of MIDEQ is a really important contribution towards that evidence base, but from the perspective of the South, which I think is critically important. That just takes us, thank you, Meron, to Rawan. Did you have some final concluding recommendations that you'd like to see happen before we move to Daniela?
Okay, thank you. I agree that there's a lack of data in this area. So I think we need to do more research into the subject and the recommendations to be taken into consideration by different stakeholders. And in our research level, we try to take it to policies level and try to work with government on this issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rawan. I see that we're running out of time. I see we have two final, well, we won't have time to answer the question, but two final comments. An additional consideration might be reflecting on critiques of concepts such as resilience and adaptation. Again, I think you're absolutely right, member of the audience who made that question, because those are also very much rooted, I think, in global north or Eurocentric ideas about what resilience is and what it constitutes. And the final point was, how are children left behind in host countries perceived by their parents in their country of origin and by those who take them, and mechanisms in place in order to prevent trafficking, for example, in the Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire context. And I know, Gabriel, you're doing work specifically on that. So I would encourage audience members to get in touch directly with the researchers if they want to follow up with any of those points, because I'm sure that there is much more that could be said. Daniela, would you like to make any final concluding remarks before we wrap? I'd be very interested again to see where you'd like our research to be taken.
Yes, so maybe responding also to one comment that was made in the chat, I think the pandemic really put the rights of labor migrants and their families into the center of our discussions. I think a lot of, there was migrant workers that kept our economies going, while at the same time often being excluded from some of the responses in the pandemic, be it social protection or health. And I think since then, we've really seen a bit of a shift in the discourse and really understanding that, no one is safe until everyone is safe. That was one of the sort of the slogans, and really looking at what we can do to strengthen systems that work for everyone, including migrant children, displaced children, children that are left behind. And I think this is really sort of the call to invest in inclusive systems, be it social protection, child protection systems that work for all children. And then, of course, the issue of investing in or making pathways safe and legal, so that parents are able to move with their children, and having that sort of that shift in discourse from the framing that continues to be very much about safety and security to really the rights of migrants and their children, and yeah, that right to family unity. And in terms of the research, I think I'd really love to see more research from the Global South. I think challenging that concept of the nuclear family is something I really enjoyed throughout reading the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. I think that we certainly hope that will continue within MIDEQ. Very delighted to have our MIDEQ speakers here today. Thank you to all of you, to Anita, to Meron, to Gabriel, and to Rowan. Thank you also, Daniela, for your contribution, a really important one. Thanks, people behind the scenes that you don't necessarily see, but that are critically important. Jack, Jacob, and Emma have been brilliant in pulling together this event. So grateful to all of you, and of course to the audience for participating. Our next UNU-CPR roundtable, as I say, will be in September, the 6th of September, with UN Women, looking at the issue of gender and migration. Of course, we've heard a lot about gender today as well, so I'm sure that you may be interested in that. But Ben, behind the scenes at Positive Negatives, and Mackenzie as well in MIDEQ, thank you all. And it's been a fantastic discussion. I'm really always happy with these roundtables to have more of an in-depth discussion, and really appreciate the contributions from you all. So thank you very much. We'll stay in touch for sure. And I hope we'll get to do some more of this work together, because I think it's a really critical juncture to sort of do some reframing based on the learning that we're having out of our fantastic Global South scholars. So thank you all. I'm going to give you a round of applause sort of virtually. Really grateful for your contributions, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.